Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today for Baroque for Breakfast. And today I'm going to be talking about bassoons. I said in my email that I was going to try to cover 5 centuries of history in 1 hour, so it'll be a bit of a whirlwind tour, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. I've got 3 of my instruments here that I can show, and with that I'll just get started. Share the screen. Okay, we're going to be talking about bassoons today. I'm not going to talk about everything on this picture. In fact, the first 3 things are not even bassoons. I'm not sure why they're on this picture, but those are shawms. The next one is a dulcian, which I'll show you today. 2/over is a Baroque bassoon. This one here is a classical bassoon. And these are various modern bassoons and contrabassoon, which I won't really get into today either. So just a bit of an outline of what I'll be talking about. We'll talk about the origin of the bassoon, vague though they are, and we'll talk about the dulcian, the Baroque bassoon, classical bassoon, and what some people call the scientific bassoon, a little bit about modern bassoon, and maybe a few minutes on reeds if we have time. Mostly I'll be talking about the dulcian and the Baroque bassoon because those are the ones of interest to us at Salt Spring Baroque. So this is a quote that I like from James Copp's book about the bassoon. The bassoon is a happy accident, a biotechnical workaround that quickly became an archetype. And that really sums it up. They needed to build an instrument as a workaround, and it actually turned into a really useful instrument and became the archetype for future bassoons. So as far as the origins of the bassoon go, the early history is very obscure because there aren't many specimens surviving. Obviously they're made of wood, and so there aren't too many around now from the original period. There is some iconographic evidence, and there also are many origin myths because there was a lot of confusion about naming. So when the scholars have gone back to review the evidence, hasn't been entirely clear what instrument people are talking about in some of the evidence. So I'll just go through some of this. So here are a few pictures of some of the iconographic evidence of early bassoons. And these are all pictures of dulcians. Up in the top left is a picture from a relief on the Freiburg Cathedral that shows a dulcian. The dulcian is the one here with the vocal or mouthpiece. So it's not the one on the top, it's the one underneath. And this one down at the bottom also shows the dulcian. You can see here the telltale vocal. This is the dulcian underneath here. And on the right is a plate number 10 from Michael Pretorius' work in 1620. It shows a whole family of dulcians up in the top here, from descant, alto, tenor bass, quart bass, octave bass, and quint bass. So these instruments were made in consorts, just like recorders, shawms, and other Renaissance type instruments. So I mentioned the different names. There's been many names attributed to the precursor of the bassoon, which we call in North America the dulcian. Some of the names refer to the shortened length of the instrument, and I'll get into that when I talk about the design. But so in the UK, in most of Europe, they call it a curtal, which refers to the curtailing of the length. And we call it the dulcian, which refers to the supposedly gentle sound, gentler than the shawm, which was the instrument they used before the dulcian came into being. Then there are words that refer to the bass register of the instrument, such as bassoon, basson, bassano. And then finally, there is the resemblance to a bundle of sticks, fagot, fagotto, etc. This one is controversial because the early bassoon, the dulcian, didn't look like a bundle of sticks. It didn't come to look that way until later on. So it's really unclear why they're called fagottos in the early literature. So there are quite a few origin myths about the bassoon, all of which have now been debunked. Some people thought that it was evolved from the crumhorn, not crumhorn, but this is a bass oboe. This on the bottom, on the lower left, and some people thought that it may have evolved from that, but that has been proven untrue. And on the right, there's an instrument called the fagotum, and this instrument has two bores that are connected, but it's actually a bagpipe type instrument, so it's really nothing like a bassoon at all. But I think because of the name fagotum, some early scholars thought that that might have been the precursor to the bassoon. But in fact, it all comes down to necessity. If you watched my presentation on wind bands, you'll have seen these photos before. But in the wind bands of the Renaissance and early Baroque, they usually used shawms, which are the precursor to the oboe. And as composers started writing for lower and lower voices, they had to keep increasing the size of the shawm, so they just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is a gross bass palmer, which are a type of shawm basically. Here's an etching from 1679 showing Nicole Rosenkron with, he's either very tall or his son is very short, but this is his son playing the violin and him holding a gross bass palmer. And this is a fellow who makes these instruments today in the Netherlands, and he's holding a gross bass palmer, which are about 8 feet tall. So you can imagine that these type of instruments were not easy to transport, not very versatile. You couldn't actually have one in a marching band or lug it up a spiral staircase to the top of a castle turret, for example. So there was a necessity to get an 8-foot long instrument that was more usable and portable. And this is how the dulcian arose. So the dulcian is now considered the precursor to the Baroque bassoon. And we don't know who invented it, but it was probably in northern Italy because that's where we first see mention of it and the iconographic evidence. The first citations of it in literature are from 1516, and the first drawings of it are from 1563. So the dulcian was used in both the Renaissance and Baroque periods. It was in use throughout the Baroque, even at the same time as the Baroque bassoon. It is a one-piece instrument and has 2 keys. Now here are the basic principles of the dulcian, which keep in mind these basic principles apply to the bassoon throughout history. It was the original design of the dulcian, and it basically is still the original design of the modern bassoon. So the instrument is played with a double reed, just like an oboe. There's a bocal, or a mouthpiece. In England, they call that a crook. The instrument has a double bore. So It starts out with one piece of wood, and then the maker drills a hole um, down to the bottom, and then drills another hole from the bottom up to the top. And it's a conical bore, so it's not exactly the same. It gets bigger as it goes down, and then it gets bigger as it goes up to the flare in the bell. So you drill these two holes, and then they drill another hole going across to connect the two, and then they plug up the sides of that hole that goes across. So you end up with a U, sort of a U tube at the bottom. And you can see here just an example of a dulcian that's been taken apart. You can see the two bores there. One is slightly bigger than the other. This will be a cross section from near the top. And an important factor in the dulcian and the bassoon is that the tone holes you see here, there's 6 on the one side, they're oblique. They're not just going perpendicular to the instrument. And this is so that the person can finger the notes, so that they're closer together, so it can actually fit your hands. And it turns out that this oblique setting of the tone holes really affects the sound and timbre of the instrument. And I'll talk about that some more later. So I'm going to stop the sharing and go to my other camera and show you my dulcian. So we'll see if this works. Okay, so this is my dulcian. I've only had it less than a year, and this is made by Vincenzo Onida in Milan, and it's a replica of one that's in the Musical Museum in Berlin. So you can see here what I was just mentioning. It's made out of one piece of wood, and the maker would drill a hole down this length of the piece of wood and then back up this side, and then drill another hole here, perpendicular, and plug up the ends of those. Now this instrument has 6 tone holes, and they're drilled obliquely. You probably can't see, but they're going in at an angle. And it has 2 keys, one here on the front. This is called a swallowtail key, and they made them that way so that people could play the instrument either right-handed or left-handed. And on the back there's 1 or 2 tone holes for your thumbs, and 1 key underneath this plate operated by your thumb. Now just remember that there's 1 key operated by your thumb. As we get into other bassoons, that number increasingly gets bigger. And you put the bocal in the top here, and I've got the bocal wrong, but I want you to be able to see it. And that's basically what the dulcian looks like. It's about 4 feet tall. This one is made of maple, and it's got a dark stain on it. You often see them unstained with just a lighter color, but I like this one. And that's what the dulcian looks like. So now I'll switch back again to the other camera and my presentation. So more about the dulcian. This instrument was first used to support singers in Gregorian chant. So it gave some volume to support the singers and also something for them to tune to. So this early dulcian was called the fagotto chorista. And like I said, we're not quite sure why it was called fagotto at that time, because it didn't look like a bundle of sticks. Maybe if you had a whole consort of them lying together, it might look that way. And the most popular one for this supporting the singers was the bass dulcian. And it was either only used as a bass or in addition to the organ or to double the men's bass voices. And they were also used in the alto band, which I talked about in a previous presentation. So it would be in a band along with shawms and trombones mostly. And particularly in the Renaissance, they were used in consorts. So here's a picture of a consort of dulcians ranging from the small soprano up to the great bass. And towards the end of the Renaissance or early Baroque, it became more common to have virtuosic, composers would write virtuosically for solo instruments. And so that became quite popular with the dulcian. I'm going to show a couple of examples. Here is a consort playing. In this one you have 3 bass dulcians and 2 tenor dulcians. The fellow in the middle is the maker of my instrument, Vincenzo Anita, so I'll give him a little bit of a plug here. And hopefully you can hear this, and I'll just play a little bit of this so you can get an idea. So that's an example of 5 dulcians in consort. Now I'd like to show you an example of some of the virtuosic playing that I mentioned before. This is by Giovanni Bertoli, Composizioni Musicali from 1645. And this is probably the first published dulcian sonata collection. These are very difficult pieces. Believe me, I'm trying to learn some of them. And most of them are in C major or easy keys like that, because you have 2 keys on this instrument, so it's not very easy to play chromatically. So I'll play a little bit of this. that's a good example of some of the virtuosic playing that you saw in the early Baroque period. So now I'd like to move on to the Baroque bassoon. We think this was invented around 1668 in France. Um, Essentially what happened is Nicolas Haute showed up with a basson in the court of Louis XIV in 1668, and if you're an oboe player or a flute player, you probably recognize the name Haute. He was a maker who made lots of different woodwind instruments, and the records show that he was playing something called the basson. And we have well-preserved three-keyed instruments datable to 1699. And then there's also this painting that we have from the similar era showing, it's called Der Fagottspieler, showing a guy with a Baroque bassoon. So here's some of the differences between the Baroque bassoon and the Dulcian. It's a four-piece instrument, and I'll show you mine in a minute. It goes down to a low B flat, which is one tone below the Dulcian, and it's theorized that this was needed to match the bass, the range of the bass violin. And also something was needed to match the new French flatter pitch. Instruments were still at a much higher pitch in Germany. They were, as Marco talked about pitch in his presentation, the higher pitch was matching the organs mostly. But at the French court, they were playing at a much lower pitch. And the Baroque bassoon was designed that way. It has a longer bore, which enabled to get better tone, easier playing in the higher register. Now I'm just going to switch to the other camera now, and I'll show you my Baroque bassoon. Now this is my Baroque bassoon, and this instrument was made by Leslie Ross, who's a maker in Maine, United States. And this is a replica of an Eichentopf bassoon, so a German instrument, probably from the early 1700s. And this bassoon probably was played in Dresden and probably would have been the type of bassoon that was played in Bach's orchestra at the time. Now I'll just take it apart to show you the idea of this bundle of sticks thing that is mentioned. So it comes apart into four pieces. You can see there. And it's easily transportable that way. And also you can get at each individual piece if you need to repair something. Unlike the Dulcian, which you can't get inside it, there's not really anything you can do if something goes wrong. Whereas in this case, you can take it apart and the maker can just work on one piece. So it has actually a, let's see, the joints have thread wrapped around them. In modern instruments, you would have cork, but in these you have thread. And you can see here the two bores going into the boot joint. And the base has just got wax plugging off the bottom below the U bend. I'll just put it back together again and show the keys, etc. So this is the front. This is the front of the instrument. It has 6 tone holes, just like the Dulcian, and 2 keys down here. 2 keys played with your right pinky finger. And then in the back, it has 3 keys. The first Baroque bassoons um, only had 3 or 4 keys, but I have the sort of later model that has one extra key, which enables me to play an E flat. So there's 3 keys in the back, operated by your left thumb. So you remember the Dulcian, we had 1 key operated by the thumb. Now we're up to 3 keys being operated by the thumb. Let's see. And so there's 2 tone holes in the back and 6 in the front, which are those oblique, which go crossways at an oblique angle of the instrument. This is made out of maple, tiger maple, which is this kind of stripy maple. All my bassoons are made out of maple. Pretty much all bassoons are made out of maple. Not much ornamentation on this one. Little bit of curly cues on the bell. Little bit of design on the bell as far as the shape. Some of the French instruments were a lot more elaborate than the German ones. So I'll just put that back and we'll continue on with some examples. So we'll talk about some of the repertoire on the Baroque bassoon. Basically, the playing shifted from playing in consort from the Renaissance to a bass instrument plus 1 or 2 higher voices. And at this time, the trio sonata was in vogue, so a lot of trio sonatas were played with 1 bassoon and 2 oboes. It was also used as a continuo instrument, possibly in addition to a stringed continuo instrument like a viola da gamba or cello. And it was used a lot in French music. Lully and Rameau, they really made the Baroque bassoon popular in their music, especially with obbligato parts in operas, cantatas. And more sonatas were written for the bassoon by this time. Telemann, Galliard were 2 of the composers who wrote a lot of bassoon sonatas. And Vivaldi wrote 39 bassoon concertos that would have been written for the Baroque bassoon. Now I'd just like to show an example of something from a Rameau opera. It's said that Rameau did more to transform the role of the bassoon than any other composer. He used it a lot, and he increased the range. He wrote for a high register, really made use of the singing quality of the tenor register in the bassoon. Now I'd just like to play a little bit from scene 1 from Dardanus. You can, where the bassoon plays along with the singer. Here's the bassoon part here. He's got these stereotypical leaps that are popular in bassoon writing. And he sort of introduces the singer. And then a little bit later on, there's a bit of a duet with the singer. So I just play a bit of this. that's an example of bassoon playing with a singer in some of Rameau's writing. And that particular scene is the prison scene, and you can hear the sort of the bassoon in the tenor register with that um, ster- um, let me see, plaintive, I guess, plaintive type of sound that you get from the tenor register. Just a few comments on Bach. He used the bassoon in dozens of compositions, as I mentioned earlier, either as a continuo or calla parte with the basses in the choir, and also obligato parts. And I'd just like to play an example from Cantata BWV 155, where the second movement, the bassoon has a nice obligato part, and then there's two singers that sing along with the bassoon. So that's an example of how bassoons were used by Bach, playing along and with conversation with some singers. So now I'd just like to play something by Vivaldi. I mentioned that he wrote 38 concertos for bassoon. Most of these he wrote while he was working at the Pietà. And I'd like to just play this second movement from the concerto in A minor. And while you're listening to this, just note how he makes great use of both the bass register and the tenor register in this piece. And it has the different leaps and now I'd like to play something by Vivaldi. Vivaldi wrote 38 bassoon concertos for Baroque bassoon, and he wrote most of these while he was working at the Pietà. I'd like to play the Larghetto from the concerto in A minor, and this features Dominique Teresi, who is the bassoon player for Tafel Music. He also teaches Baroque bassoon at Juilliard. Amazing player. And while you're listening to this is a beautiful piece. It's not a virtuosic piece, but just listen to how Vivaldi makes the most out of the range of the bassoon. You can hear the bass register, and there's a lot of leaps from low to high, and then there's that beautiful tenor register playing, which has been described as the instrument that's closest to the human voice, is the bassoon when it's played in the tenor register. So I'll just play some of this now. That's an example from one of the Vivaldi bassoon concertos written for Baroque bassoon. And another composer who wrote a lot of sonatas for Baroque bassoon was Telemann. And this is part of his sonata in F minor, which was the first sonata written for Baroque bassoon. And this is quite a famous sonata that all bassoonists have to learn. I'm going to fast forward and see if I can find the second movement, which is quite impressive. I could listen to that all day, but I need to move on. So, okay. We'll talk about the classical bassoon briefly. I don't have one of these instruments to show you, but they were incremental rather than revolutionary developments. And these incremental developments were brought about due to four trends in music. Composers started to write in increasingly remote keys. For example, Haydn's Farewell Symphony has an obligato bassoon part in F sharp minor, which is not very playable on a Baroque bassoon. Composers wanted a more powerful sound. They wanted increasing use of the tenor register, and the pitch again was continuing to get higher. So some of the changes on a classical bassoon, four keys were added. So now you could play E flat, B flat, F sharp, and C sharp. The bore was narrowed, which allowed you to play higher notes up to A4 by overblowing. The walls were thinner, which allowed for a more powerful sound. And there was a trend toward more open bells, which again made for a brighter, more resonant and powerful sound. Often in the classical period, the scoring trends included a bassoon among the strings to give more definition to the bass line, or the bassoon in the tenor register was used to double singers, the violin, or treble woodwinds. And both of these trends in scoring were used in Mozart's Marriage of Figaro. Just go to the next slide. This is from the overture from the Marriage of Figaro. You can see here in the fourth line, this is the bassoon part, and it's doubling the cello and bass part. So this is the opening. And interestingly enough, that the fingerings for this on the bassoon are reasonably easy on Baroque bassoon. You just have to, actually with this finger, you just have to go like this with your the right forefinger. If you try to play this on modern bassoon, there are many keys to try to get the accidentals in better pitch. And it's actually quite difficult on modern bassoon, and this excerpt is in every bassoon audition. And further along, you see this is the bassoon line on the top, and this is the violin line. So it's doubling the violins at this point. This is da 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 da. So that's an example of it, where they're doubling the violins on the tenor register of the bassoon. Now I'm just going to go back, I think, to this recording, and I'll just play a little bit of it, and you can listen for the bassoons. In the first part, doubling the bass line, doubling the bass strings, and then later on doubling the violin. So that's an example of how the bassoons were often used in the classical period. So after the classical period, there was this period from about nearly 100 years, from 1830 to the early 1900s, and some people who study the bassoon history have called this period a period of the scientific bassoon. So this was the dawn of the symphonic era, and there were increasingly more difficult musical demands. You had the romantic composers such as Berlioz and Wagner, who wrote for larger orchestras, louder orchestras. The concert halls became larger and larger. There was new science becoming available about acoustics. The world was starting to open up with things like trade shows. Everybody was trying to make a better bassoon. There was mass production. They could make large numbers of instruments with great precision. There were patents, so if they thought they had created something special, they could patent it. They gave things modern sounding trade names such as bassonore. And one of the things that became popular was a musical press. So you often had critics writing in the press that the bassoonists couldn't play such and such, or their pitch was bad, or so bassoon makers, and not just the main bassoon makers, but everyone was trying all sorts of different things to try to make a better bassoon. And most of these things, well, all of these things were not really successful. I'll show you a few examples. So here's one by Gautreau, which they decided they were going to try to make a bassoon with clarinet-like keys. If I'm a clarinet player as well, if you play clarinet, you will notice that these keys, particularly for the left and the right pinky fingers, this is identical to the way a clarinet looks. And I have no idea how this might sound, but these also had the tone holes were just drilled straight through perpendicular. They didn't have that oblique setting that gives the bassoon its characteristic sound. So that's one that was made to look like a clarinet. Here's one uh, by Bohm, I guess, which is sort of, this is not a great picture, but you can visualize that it looks like a flute. So every tone hole was fully covered like a flute is, and the tone holes were proportionally spaced. They weren't spaced as they were on the Baroque bassoon. Um, People thought it was important to have mathematically correct spacing of the holes. So this was one where they tried that. They played around with the different bells. Here's a bell that looks basically like my Baroque bassoon. They started making bigger and bigger bells. They started putting brass bells on. Um, at the time, the brass instruments were starting to get valves, and they were becoming much more efficient, louder, could play faster, things like that. So they were trying to sort of make a brassy bassoon. They thought would be more able to compete with the brass in the bands of the time. So they did silly things like put brass bells on a wooden bassoon. Um, Adolf Sachs even got into the bassoon making business. This is not it, but he actually made a bassoon out of brass, um, which wasn't very successful. And this is his sort of mathematical notes on mathematically determined tone hole locations for the bassoon. There's an interesting story in the French Conservatory at the time. Um, because the brass instruments were becoming so much better, they had some kind of a contest where they had a band with saxophones, because Adolf Sax had just invented the saxophone. They had a band with saxophones and a band with bassoons, and it was some kind of a contest, and the critics and others were evaluating which sounded better, and of course the saxophones won out. But at that time, there were 5 bassoon professors at the conservatory in Paris, and they didn't really care that the saxophone won out, and they just kept training more bassoonists. But so this was Adolf Sax even got into the act, trying to make bassoons. So after 1900, all these radical innovations sort of went away, and generally these what they call reform bassoons were generally failures. A few tweaks were made with different plates, rings, and keys added to make things easier for the player. Better keys and fingerings for trills, better response, intonation, wear, moisture, stability, cost, these kind of factors. My modern bassoon has a lining, so it's not affected by moisture like my Baroque bassoon is. So amongst this whole innovation period before 1900, 2 styles came out of that which survived: the German style made by Heckel, and the French style made by Buffet. Most bassoonists now on modern bassoons play a Heckel style of instruments, except for in France and a few other countries where they still play the French style, which has a lovely tone, it has less keys, it's closer to a Baroque bassoon. Maybe I'll just go to the other camera and show you my modern bassoon now. This is my modern bassoon. Again, it's made out of tiger maple, just like my Baroque bassoon. This is just stained a little differently. This is the front of the instrument. Still has the three tone holes. Some of them have plates around to make it a little bit easier to play. It's still 4 parts. It still has the double bore, still has the oblique tone holes, still has a bocal and a double reed, all of these same features that were present at the beginning of the Baroque bassoon. And I'll just switch it around to show you the back. So here's the back of my bassoon, and right away you'll notice so many keys. There's 12 keys here that are operated by the left thumb, and 4 keys that are operated here by the right thumb. So you've got about 16, depending on the instrument, around 16 keys that are operated by your thumbs. And if you remember, we had 3 keys on the Baroque bassoon and 1 key on the Dulcian. The classical bassoon is somewhere in the middle. But this was the biggest difference on the modern bassoon. They just kept adding all of these keys to make things easier, like trills, try to make pitch better, and then things like adding the lining to prevent moisture problems. And the bell is quite a bit longer as well on the modern bassoon. You see at the end, the modern bassoons originally were always made with ivory around the top, just for aesthetic purposes. We don't do that anymore. They're made of plastic. And maybe I'll just take the cap off the bottom, because you can see now with the cap off, you can see, let me see if I can get this, you can see how there's the U-tube on the bottom, and this is lined with metal that goes all the way up inside the wooden tubes. And on the modern instrument, you have cork connecting the joints. Here, cork, not strings anymore. You can see this brass lining that goes down through the bores to prevent moisture from getting in. And I guess that's about it. The main thing on the modern bassoons is the number of keys. It's very heavy. It's much heavier than my Baroque bassoon. So from that standpoint, the Baroque bassoon is more enjoyable to play. But you can get you can play much higher. You can go up to, F5 on this instrument, and the low range is still the B flat, just like the Baroque bassoon. Okay, just switch camera again. So with respect to repertoire for the modern bassoon, the composers continued to use the 2 distinctive voices of the bassoon. So you have the bass voice and then the tenor for the higher sort of plaintive sound. Often the bass voice is now used to comical effect, whereas the tenor register is more the poignant effect. Very different, 2 very different sounds. An example of the comical effect was in Dukas' Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Stravinsky's Rite of Spring is an example of the very high register, tenor register. And I'll just play a little bit of each of these. So the first one is the opening to the Rite of Spring, and you can hear this sort of plaintive sounding, very high tenor register. So that's the opening to Rite of Spring. And you can hear the tenor, the high tenor register there. You can also hear how the instrumentation, how it blends so well with the clarinet, the other woodwinds in that high register, clarinet and English horn. I'll just play a little bit of this. There's 4 players here from the Minnesota Orchestra playing the opening of Sorcerer's Apprentice.
I think the fun thing about this piece is that it really shows the humorous characteristic of the bassoon, and rarely you have this kind of settings where all the bassoons in the orchestra are playing.
So that's an example of the whole bassoon section playing, and that's kind of the comical part of the bassoon. The instrument on the right there was contrabassoon, which is now a 16-foot instrument. But I'm not going to talk about that. The bassoon is just getting bigger and bigger. So just a little quick summary of what I've talked about. So we have the Dulcian, the Baroque bassoon, classical bassoon, scientific bassoon, and modern bassoon. And you can see here that the lowest note only changed it went down 1 to the B flat, and the highest note continued to increase all the way up to F5, which some bassoonists can play. I can't play that high, and the main factor is the number of keys. You start out with the Dulcian with 2 keys and gradually increase keys until we're up to about 25 to 30 keys on a modern bassoon, depending on the maker. And the 3 early bassoons, the Dulcian, Baroque bassoon, and classical bassoon, originated in Italy, France, and Germany. So there's a joint sort of European history to this instrument. Now I'm pretty much done time, but I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about reeds. There's lots of videos online if you have any interest in how to make a bassoon reed, but this is sort of the stages of how to make a bassoon reed. You start out with a raw piece of cane, a tube of cane. This cane can come from various places: France, Spain, Argentina, China, Queensland, and Australia. One of my previous bassoon teachers used to go to France and scour the countryside for the exact right cane. So you start out with a tube of cane like that, about 6 inches long or so, and then you split it into 4 parts just by chopping it in half and chopping it in half again. And then you use a machine called a gouger, which takes out all that pulp, pithy stuff in the middle and makes it a lot thinner. Then you use a machine called a profiler, which makes it or the shape front to back that you want it to be. You've cut it to length by this point. And then you use something called a shaper to get that distinctive shape. This is my shaper here, where you just put the cane on there and then you use your knife to just shape the sides to get it to whatever shape you want. There's all kinds of different shapers depending on what type of shape people like for their reeds. And then once you've got it shaped, you have this is both sides of the double reed here. So you bend that over, you bend it across the middle. You can see the score line here. You bend that across the middle and you end up with what is called a blank. You put some wires on it, and then you do some scraping on these parts of the reed. You scrape it until it gets to be playable. You mess around with it, then you finish it off with securing the wires, and you end up with your reed. The reeds for the three instruments that I have, it's probably hard to see here. I'll try to line them up. So this one here is the Baroque bassoon. It's a lot wider and quite a bit longer. The one in the middle is the reed for my Dulcian, and this one here is the reed for the modern bassoon, which is the smallest one and the thinnest one. And one interesting fact on these Baroque and bassoon and Dulcian reeds is, instead of scraping them on the outside here with a knife to get it the way you want it, they did what's called an inner scrape. So they scraped the ins before they folded it over and put wires on. They would scrape the inside. Typically that's not done except for by a few purists these days, because once you've done that, you don't really have any way of getting back in there to fix things. Whereas if you scrape on the outside, you can scrape some more if it's not quite right. Of course, if you over scrape, you can't fix it either. But so that's just a couple of minutes on reed making. Like I said, there's a ton of information online if you're so inclined and want to look that up. So to summarize then, the bassoon has been around for nearly 5 centuries. So I didn't quite get it covered in an hour, but an hour and 15 minutes. And to this day, it has maintained the key features that give it its unique sound and timbre. So you have the double reed, the bocal, the double bore, and the oblique tone holes. And during that scientific period, they did tons and tons of studies changing all these things, and they could never get the same sound as they did with these key features. So the bassoon is now used in every type of music making, soloistic, chamber ensembles, orchestras. A lot of movie music has bassoons. You can listen for that now, particularly if they're looking for something scary or sad, or they use that tenor register or bass register. There's jazz bassoonists. Paul Hansen is a jazz bassoonist. You could look up some of his videos if you're interested in that. And even some rock bands have bassoons in them. So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and now I'll take any questions you might have. Thanks.